Greetings, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are watching this from at this time. It's my pleasure to welcome you all to this event and also to welcome Mark Lowcock and Alhaja Sai to this conversation. And I should say, welcome back, Mark Lowcock, because we had an opportunity to talk earlier about Mark's thinking on the impact of the COVID crisis on development last time. But today we're here to talk about a specific proposal that Mark would like to put on the table as he comes towards the end of his stint as the Undersecretary General and Emergency Relief Coordinator for the United Nations, which, of course, as people who've been following Mark's career know, has been just the sort of last 4 years of a very long career focusing on development and humanitarian issues. And we're going to come back to his proposal in a minute. And I also want to say that it's a real pleasure for us today to have Alhaja Sai on this event as going to give his perspective on Mark's proposal. I'll come to him in due course. And for those who have been following him, I would say that probably you've worked on more international institutions than anybody that I know. I mean, every bit of the UN system, NGOs, most recently, of course, Secretary General of the IFRC, the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescents, and currently chair of the Kofi Annan Foundation, and also co-chair of the Global Preparedness Monitoring Board, which, as you know, has been looking at the issues around health security, very much a big focus of how we can improve our response, not just to this, but to future pandemics. So I'll come to you in due course. Now, let me also say at this point that for those of you who are watching this live, and I know that many people are, very much like you to send in your questions that we can pose to our panelists. And to do that, you can tweet your question at CGDev, hashtag CGD Talks. You can comment on the YouTube channel where you're watching this, or you email us at events at cgdev.org, and all of those will work their way through to me, and I will then make sure that I come back with your questions. So the specific proposal that Mark's going to talk to us about today is relates to how you can strengthen accountability to people in the humanitarian system. And this is a topic that actually is very close to CGD's interests. You've been following some work that we have been doing over the past 2 or 3 years, in particular, Jeremy Conondike, Patrick Sayers, two of my colleagues here, have been looking at ways in which power and influence inside the humanitarian system affects the outcomes. And they made a set of recommendations. I think everybody sort of recognizes that the purpose of the humanitarian system is to serve people in need. But we also recognize that those people in need sometimes have the least influence in shaping how the humanitarian system responds, because it's the structure of it and the incentives in it are such that the agencies and the actors, who are all people trying to do their best, are trying to do so in response to their donors and their governing boards as much as they are to the people they're trying to serve. And so here we have a specific idea that Mark has now come up and would like to propose. And what I would like to do now is turn it over to Mark and then have him walk us through his ideas. I might then pose one or two questions, and then if I could, I'd like to come to you aside for your comments and reactions to this. And then we will open it up to questions that might come in from those who are watching online. So that's the plan. Let me turn to you, Mark, now. Welcome again, and very much looking forward to your comments.
Well, Masood, thank you very much indeed. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. I must say I'm really thrilled to be having this discussion at CGD because, as you just said, Masood, a lot of the most interesting ideas on how to deal with this accountability problem have been generated by people like Jeremy and others at CGD in recent years. And so I know we're going to have a well-informed and a challenging and a well-motivated discussion. I'm also really thrilled that we have Az with us. Az and I work very closely together when, in his last period actually, as the Secretary General of the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies. There's almost nobody, I don't think there's anybody actually, who I've worked with in the humanitarian world over recent years who I've admired as much as I have admired Az. And I'm sure we're going to hear a very, honest and well-informed and insightful contribution from him. So I'm very thrilled, actually, that Az is able to join us. Yes, Masood, as you said, I'm coming to the end of my time as the Emergency Relief Coordinator. Only one of my 12 predecessors have served longer, actually. I suspect all of us feel we've done the job in trying circumstances, but according to the UN's official data, the last 4 years have seen the biggest recorded increase in humanitarian needs since this job was created. And that's because of the combination of conflict, climate change, and COVID. Now, the global humanitarian system, tens of thousands of people around the world working for NGOs and the Red Cross and Red Crescent organizations and the UN, is a really remarkable public good. It certainly saves millions of lives every year, often overcoming huge obstacles, and the world would be a lot worse without it. But the truth is that the humanitarian system currently is overwhelmed and overstretched. The scale and the complexities of the crises we face today are putting our system under enormous strain. Something like 1 person in 33 across the planet right now needs humanitarian assistance or protection, more than at any time since the Second World War. Nearly 80 million people are displaced by conflict and violence. Wars now last twice as long as they did in the early 1990s. And so humanitarian agencies have to stay and operate in countries much longer than ever before. And this gets expensive. This year's Global Humanitarian Overview, which I published in early December, seeks $35 billion compared with just $2 billion in the late 1990s. Now, donors are more generous than ever before, but funding has failed to keep pace with rising needs. We've seen an average of 40% funding shortfalls every year for the last 5 years. And I think the current trajectory we're on is simply unsustainable. The truth is, unless we address the causes of crises, mostly conflict and climate change and deadly diseases, needs are going to grow and funding is going to be insufficient to meet those needs. Humanitarian agencies, of course, can only ever respond to the symptoms of global crises. We'll never be a means to play the largest role in solving their root causes. We can only alleviate the suffering they cause, but we can't stop them from happening. So the challenges that the humanitarian system are going to face in the next decade are really very daunting. So the question that arises is how we can best prepare as a humanitarian system to deal with what's coming and to provide the best possible help for people in crisis. And I've reached the view that one of the biggest failings of the humanitarian system is that we don't pay enough attention to what people caught up in crises say they want, and then trying to give that to them. It's actually quite rare in all the senior level discussions that I've had about various crises that these two basic questions are the main focus of attention. So why is that? Well, you touched on it, Masood, at the beginning. It's because despite all our good intentions, the humanitarian system actually is set up to give people in need what international agencies and donors think is best and what the agencies have to offer, rather than giving people what they themselves say they most need. Let me give you some examples. In Chad and Cox's Bazar and other places too, people in dire humanitarian need are frequently selling aid that they've been given to buy something else they want more. And that is a clear indication that what's being provided doesn't meet people's needs and their preferences. After the Central Sulawesi earthquake in 2018, I remember going there, almost half of displaced households reported shelter as one of their most important and immediate priorities, but only a small fraction of people got immediate help with shelter. In Iraq, a 2019 survey shows people want job opportunities and cash and food and household items that help them reduce their dependency. But only 16% of people asked are included, only 16% of people believe that their opinions are included in aid and service provision. And unfortunately, these are not isolated examples, and nor am I the first person to say all this. Over the last decade, there's been a growing recognition that affected people should have more say over the type of help they get and how they get it. This has theoretically been part of every reform agenda in the system for the last 20 years. So it's not only morally the right thing to do to give people more say, it gives them greater dignity, it gives them more control over their lives. It will also make our system more efficient, and it will offer financiers better value for money if we do more of the things people say they want us to do. The impact of attempts to address this so far have been limited, unfortunately. Last year, more than half the people surveyed in Burkina Faso, the Central African Republic, Chad, Nigeria, Somalia, and Uganda said that the aid they received did not cover their most important needs. In Chad, in fact, only 12% of people surveyed were positive about the aid they received. So why is there so little progress despite the efforts that have been made? Well, firstly, in many places, we have information on what people want and how they want it. So the problem is that we're not consistently acting on that information. Second, the approach has been too piecemeal. There has been progress over the past few years, and often individual organizations or programs are doing a very good job, but that's not enough. What is needed is for organizations and decision makers as a whole to make listening and responding to people their real priority. The third point is there's no incentive really, not sufficient incentive to change. Ultimately, organizations and decision makers can choose to listen to people and be responsive, or they can choose not to. There aren't really consequences for the choices they make, and the incentives to push them in the right direction are too weak. The humanitarian system is not held accountable for what people ask for versus what they receive. There's no independent assessment of how agencies perform in this regard. Accountability runs mostly to the donors, not to the affected people. And people's needs are too easily dismissed due to lack of funding or needs being outside the scope of what individual organizations can provide. Actually, I think lack of funding makes it even more important that we deliver what people say they most want. So we have a responsibility to overcome these obstacles, but it's also rational and efficient for us to do so. So my proposal is that we pilot an independent commission for voices in crises. That's an independent body that holds the system to account. And if we hold up a mirror like that to the system, humanitarian agencies collectively, I think, will see that we're simply not adequately listening and responding to what people say they want. We need actually to increase awareness of that gap between what's delivered in a crisis and what people actually say they want. And if we do that, we'll be able to increase the consequences for humanitarian agencies of not listening. So this has the power to change how agencies make decisions about the support they'll provide. There is a more detailed policy paper available right now on the OCHA website. We've just put it up, but let me just summarize quickly the main points. This independent commission would have 4 objectives. Firstly, it would issue public reports on the needs prioritized by people in a given crisis and advocate with senior level decision makers on those needs. Secondly, it would grade the humanitarian response plan as soon as it's issued on how well the planning and programming responds to needs identified by affected people, so we can see as early as possible whether people are being listened to. Thirdly, the Commission would review and publish interim findings to highlight evolving needs and promote course correction during the course of responding to a crisis by aid organisations. And finally, the Commission would publicly evaluate and grade the humanitarian response to independently assess ex post how well the response matched people's needs and priorities. For a commission like this to be successful, it has to be independent from all the operational humanitarian organisations. We can't, in humanitarian agencies, simply mark our own homework. The findings of the Commission and the grades they generate should be transparent and should be publicly available. And it should, wherever possible, draw on existing sources of information rather than creating new data gathering exercises. So again, finding the right incentives to change the system is the key point. How the money flows through the system is clearly one of the most powerful incentives. So actually the donors, the financiers, hold the most powerful levers. But we do have some scope for action ourselves within the humanitarian system. So I also propose, recognising we have some scope ourselves to act, that we start with the funds that my own office, OCHA, manages. So the UN Central Emergency Response Fund and country-based pooled funds. Together, they generate something like $1.7 billion a year. And we can, within those funds, institute systems to prioritize allocations to programs that directly respond to affected people's own expressed priorities. But the Commission should also work with donors and partner organizations to explore what other incentives can be used. Because, as I say, the central point is that the behavior of those who finance the humanitarian system is critical as to whether or not we can change. I believe that a 3-year pilot should be launched to get this going. I do think this has the power to make a significant impact in people's lives, because listening to people, giving them what they say they want and helping them take more control over their own lives should be the way humanitarian agencies do business. So these are my proposals and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Mark. That's, as I'd expected, very clear and very practical. And I think it's congratulations for kicking off this. I mean, there's no doubt that this is a conversation and a debate that needs to be had. And now we need to go from having a conversation about it to actually coming up with some proposals that would advance what everybody agrees is an objective, but we haven't yet found a way to do it. So I want to bring Az in as quickly as possible, but before I do that, just want to get a little bit your sense on a couple of things. So one is that, so I see how this commission will serve the role of being an independent monitor and a mirror, if you like, to the agencies, and through them or alongside them to the donors who fund the agencies also, because they'll see what's happening. But then the question becomes, what is the built-in, is there a sort of hard wiring from looking at the mirror to actually then changing behavior? And so you've got the pooled funds link, that's one bit of it. I mean, for the moment, pooled funds are a relatively small part of the total amount of funding, so it's a place to start. Should we, for example, going back to my days in the IMF, where if you have an independent evaluation office does a review of the IMF's work in response to the Euro crisis, for example, and then there is a management response. So the IMF management and staff then put forward a response that says, this is how we are going to take on board the recommendations from this independent evaluation that has been done of our work. This is where we agree, this is where we disagree, and this is sort of the steps we'll take. I was wondering whether in your mind there is a need for some parallel response mechanism to the independent commission's findings that would help to bind a little bit, the system into actually focusing on a response. And then the final question I had was, some of these things are going to be dealt with agency by agency. You might do a sort of review. I don't know whether in your mind they would grade the response or the actions of individual agencies in a particular crisis as well, or just look at the overall response. But if they did agency by agency, agencies can act. But some of these things really, the findings will point to failures, and I do think of them as failures in the system, to system-wide failures, if you like, to respond. And there, it's hard for any individual agency to act. And in a way, you go back a bit to the donors who finance and fund a lot of these agencies and getting them to change their behavior. So in some ways, I'm trying to think of like, who is at the other end of this commission? The commission kind of comes up with the stuff, and who's at the other end. So any reactions to those before I come to us?
Yeah, I mean, I think you've got to the heart of a lot of the issues we need to address there, Masood, in your questions. So let me say a few things. Firstly, I just want to say, I think there are a couple of responses, some of which I've already started to see on social media to this, that I hope colleagues will be very wary of. The first response, which I've started to see in one or two places, is the critique from the right, basically, which is that, the allegation is, what I'm saying is the agencies don't do a good job, and, the world should be wary of them. That is approximately the opposite of what I'm saying, obviously. I had an opinion piece in the Times newspaper in London today saying what's needed is more assistance, is an increase in help for these very vulnerable people. So just be wary of that attack from the right. The second thing to be wary of, though, is a lot of defensive reactions from inside the system. I defy anybody who's honest and experienced in the system to disagree that these are real problems and we need to find solutions to them. I'm not saying what I'm setting out is the only solution, but I am saying we need to do something about this. Now, obviously, a starting point, to take up your next point, is simply to display publicly the difference between what people in crises say they want and what they get. That's just a starting point. But my theory of change, if you like, is that people respond to incentives, and information is itself quite a powerful incentive. And I think there is a good question about what wider processes one might build around the question of discussion of information and response to information. And I think your IMF Evaluation Office is a very good example of that, actually. I also recall, as possibly you do, the experience of setting up in the UK the Independent Commission on Aid Impact, which in 2010, when the government finally committed to getting to and sticking to the 0.7 target in the UK, was set up to try to make sure there were incentives to spend the money as wisely as possible. And I spent a lot of my time in my more than 6 years tenure as the Permanent Secretary in DFID scrutinizing the results of independent evaluation and having to respond to it, to provide management responses. And the issue was not whether I agreed with the critique or didn't agree with it. It was having to think carefully about it and defend and justify, including in Parliament, the actions we were taking to deal with it. And that's very powerful, and particularly because it's public and transparent. So I think those kind of processes are an important complement, and whether they were set up or not and how donors acted on them would be, in fact, one of the tests of whether this commission is turning out to be a useful thing or not. Your last point about the difference in the system-wide and the agency by agency is, of course, the result of a design principle across the humanitarian system. And the design principle is the world has decided in its wisdom to have multiple agencies, often dealing with, one dimension of a crisis. So we have an agency for food, an agency for refugees, an agency for women, and so on. And the truth, as we know, is that no one organization on its own can deal with any single crisis, really. Multiple agencies typically need to be involved in a response to a crisis. Some parts of the system are more comprehensive than others in their response. The Red Cross Red Crescent family is an example of that. But the scale of what's needed is often much bigger than can be dealt with on its own by the Red Cross Red Crescent system. Now, the recognition of that kind of design feature of the system is what led in 1991 to the creation of my post and the creation of the Interagency Standing Committee. It's the fundamental challenge to get a coordinated, effective response, which is meeting all of people's needs. And of course, the nature of things is that any one agency at any moment can probably find a way to explain why it's not them who should change anything they're doing. Now, fundamentally, the people who have the biggest levers over all of that is the people who pay the bills at the end of the day. And they're overwhelmingly 70% of the money for the $20 billion that for appeals I coordinated last year, we raised, came from 4 sources: the US, the European Commission, Germany, and the UK. So decision makers in those 4 places have enormous levers. 90% of the money, in fact, came from 10 or 15. So one of the key questions is, how are those decision makers, and there's not just one person in each of those organizations, there's many, many people, but they do have quite a lot of collective and system power. So the issue is, why do they pay attention to this? And part of my theory of change is that being public and transparent and generating debate and having events like this and having newspapers cover it and having it on that's how you generate a response. And I think from other things I've seen, it can be quite powerful. And the beneficiaries will be the people at the moment who have least voice and say, which are the people who we're supposed to be helping.
Absolutely. And in a way, just to make 2 footnotes to what you were just saying, one, in government, whether it's the UK or the US or Germany, the affiliation with any particular agency in the international system often is linked with a particular office or unit in the national government. So the mirroring of the fragmentation that you see internationally is actually then projected back into the national systems. And so, somebody is responsible for WFP and they're really keen to protect WFP and that's their focus. Somebody else is very focused on UNICEF and so very keen to protect the UNICEF bit. So taking this broader view is going to be a challenge inside the system as well, because if you need a broader view, then you really got to sort of step away from being the sponsor of individual agencies in your government to being the promoter of an effective humanitarian response by your government. I think that's a very different mindset that I would say. And I want to now come back to as you've sort of been listening to this conversation, and of course you bring so many different perspectives on it, and I'd be grateful for any comments that you have, but I couldn't help thinking of the parallel with one of your current responsibilities, which is sort of as co-chair of the GPMB. Because in a way you might think of, the GPMB is not an independent commission, but in some ways, some of the things that the GPMB does is precisely to try and shine that mirror on how to make the world more effective at being prepared for pandemics. And so any insights that come from that experience also, and how that might transfer over, would be great to hear. So can I turn to you, please?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Masood. I'm very pleased to be joining Mark in this conversation because it is not a conversation he's having at the end of his tenure as the emergency response coordinator. It is a conversation that he started throughout his tenure. So that's why I have so much respect in what he says, and also the credibility of that, because we have been together in the field and the same questions, were raised, and together we tried even to bring, other colleagues and partners on board and push UN country teams, in the same perspective. Because we realize that people in humanitarian settings, they face multiple deprivations and very diverse kinds of deprivation. But across the board, they have one thing in common, which is the preservation of their human dignity. And that we share also with them. That's all what we want, all of us together, that dignity to be preserved. But they know best how to get to that. They know best how to preserve their dignities. They know best what are the entry points, to get to that. But the question is, are we asking them? Are we listening to them? Or even if they talk, are we hearing them? So instead, we tend to, with all the good intention and with all the good reason, there's no ill intention behind. We have to say that, honestly. But with all the good intention, we tend to intervene with our predefined life-saving intervention packages. And we are the ones who determine what's inside the package, is, with all the good intention. And then we wonder, that when that package is put there, people often react and see that not as theirs, but as ours. And then you hear things like, your Ebola, your COVID, your latrines programs, while I have a food issue. And on many other issues that we don't even take into account. And just to illustrate that, very one, moving and humbling situation, that was during the hurricane season, in the Caribbean. And we were priding ourselves to be always the first ones to intervene on the scene, as Red Cross, volunteers and a network. And of course, we come with the package. And then this time, we said, well, logistics is so difficult when everything, including the roads, are totally destroyed. Let's try cash. And when we did cash, and then I was listening to this lady, who I call a partner, not a beneficiary, in fact, who said, thank you. And I was expecting her to say thank you for the food, thank you, for the clothes. But he said, thank you. Now I could provide basic needs, and it coincides with my 5-year-old daughter's birthday. And I could even buy her a pair of earrings. And then when he said that, tears, was coming out of her eyes. And I also teared, because I've never in all my career thought that, a pair of earrings for a 5-year-old girl, would be part of my humanitarian, essential life-saving package. But that was, more important, than anything, for just to illustrate. Now, what we need, to really remind ourselves, with is a true humanitarian system should be embedded in human and humanitarian values. And those values are really simple, the ones of respect. Listening to people, giving them a voice, and that is a sign of respect. Engaging, with people, partnering with them, accompanying them to empower and to involve them, and be part of the solution rather than being seen either problem or people who resist or people who don't understand. And then be accountable across the board, meaning we deliver on the promises we make, to people. addressing their needs that they know best. So many promises made, so many promises broken, so in the past. And that has a consequence that translates into either building a trust or eroding a trust. And then trust is key here. We cannot have a trust without respect. We cannot have trust without accountability. We cannot have a trust without being there on the side of the people in need to accompany them to respond, to their needs. Hence again, the importance, of giving a voice. So those approaches, they exist, here and there, but they're often labeled as community approaches to be distinguished, from the formal, more official, bigger approach to humanitarian setting. And I think, Mark, what you're saying here is, how can we now embrace that as a whole systems approach, rather than just a community approach there, a donor approach there, a UN system approach there, and then the NGO. But the bottom line is, what matters to people, and that should be the base, of the approach. And I think that is the reason why I find it extremely important that the idea of the Commission could embrace that as a systems, approach that will be holding us all of us accountable, the communities themselves, the UN system, the donors, and the NGOs, as well. And that help us also be flexible and question our certainties. We're so certain about so many things, but I think when we listen, we should question those certainties. We can allow ourselves also to have moments of doubts, and those doubts will, push us to be humble, and that humility will push us to be more listening and then responding. My final point, the link with the GPMB, the Global Preparedness Monitoring Board, we realized that alongside, the same principles, we were getting into what we call a cycle of panic and neglect. We are not there when people are facing their problems, but we rush into when we have a health problem of international concern. Only then we come in, Ebola, COVID, the biggies. And then we come in, people who are facing, a problem of having water points for women. They're having, it's in the middle of the malaria season that we have not invested in, and malnutrition of children. And in the middle of all those multiple deprivation, we come in with flashy treatment centers, flashy 4x4s, and then big, investments that do not even listen to what those needs would be that could even cost less, but could be facilitating also the biggies that we would like to address. And I think, our commission is also independently raising the alarm bell around that. We said our first report was the world at risk, and that is just before COVID. And it is one of the very sad moments, when you realize that it is not good to be right. And unfortunately it happens. So now we call the second report the world in disorder, because we need to bring some order into this. And I think it is a real parallel, as you say, Masood. How can we also bring order into this by putting the communities and their voices, at the center of it? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Haz, for those comments. There's a set of questions that I'll come to in 1 second. But before that, I just want to clarify one point, because we've been talking a little bit about listening to the people you're trying to serve and designing a response that reflects that. That's kind of the core part of what you're saying. And there's a sort of parallel conversation that goes on, which is about cash versus providing specific forms of support. I'm personally, my bias is that we could be doing a lot more cash in the system than we do. And the reason we don't is often the same kinds of drivers that force us to be non-responsive to the partners, as you were calling, referring to the communities that we're trying to serve, is that in a way, the same motivations then force us to provide goods rather than cash. But there are two separate related but separate conversations. And I just want to be clear that in your mind, being more responsive doesn't automatically translate into saying that you should only do cash-based responses, because I think there will be a set of people who will come back and say, you know, there are circumstances in which people need particular services. It's very clear they need them, they ask for them. And so are you against that as well? Just to clarify that.
Fully agree with you. Masood, if there is one word that we should ban from a humanitarian response, is the word only.
Yes.
There's nothing like an only something. No only cash, no only this, no only that. And that is that questioning and that humility, I think, that is also guiding, you know, this kind of a conversation.
Exactly. All right. Mark, can I pose some of the questions that have come in? So there's a set of questions that 3 or 4 people have asked around how do we make sure that this commission is not intermediating what are actually the views of the communities that you're trying to serve. You know, how can you get direct views through? How can you find ways in which representatives of the communities are in the commission, or are there other ways in which you could do it? So that's one set of questions that is out there. And the other one is, well, maybe it's linked to that, is a question around, can it really be independent if it is just relying on the agencies to collect the data, or does it have to do its own, to what extent does it have to do its own data collection, etc.? So that's kind of one broad thing. The second is an issue of, you know, how does this relate to the idea of an ombuds function? You remember that there was a proposal to set up an ombuds function. I think it was after the, in the late 90s, you know, as a result of the joint evaluation of emergency assistance in Rwanda at the time, there was a proposal that there should be a ombudsperson, and other institutions do have an ombudsperson that is a way of bringing sort of grievances and complaints directly. So that's the second. Perhaps let's start with those two, and then we'll come back. And as if you had any thoughts on those also, it'd be great to have those. So Mark, to you, please.
Well, I think these are good and constructive questions. And by the way, thank you very much to everybody who's commented so far on this. There is what seems to be quite a lively kind of debate and kind of conversation going on some of these ideas now, which I think is good. So I think on the first question, you satisfy yourself that you really are listening to what people are saying by the governance arrangements you have for this kind of commission, and who is party to it, and the processes it has. I don't think it's actually not intrinsically that difficult a kind of thing to do. I do agree it needs to be independent of the agencies, and the data gathering needs to be independent. But actually, there's a number of organisations that have been doing this kind of thing for a little while and sort of proved some of the concept. The difficulty is they haven't had the sort of not enough attention and has been paid to them, and the scale of what's been done has been inadequate. But organisations like Ground Truth Solutions, for example, have been doing some of these things for a while and have proved some of the concepts. But thought does need to be given to governance and process type arrangements, and there are comparators in other spheres from which inspiration can be drawn. The ombuds function often is a bit more internally focused about things that organizations may have done wrong, or sort of investigating abuses and so on. What I'm suggesting here is actually a much broader thing than an ombudsman function would normally operate. I'm not against at all more use of ombudsman type of type of functions, I think, you know, in a number of particularly shared organizations, multilateral organizations, probably those sorts of functions need to be strengthened in many cases. But actually what I'm talking about here is a slightly broader thing than those kinds of functions normally are charged with.
Has any thoughts?
No, I was just nodding to agree, not really. And I think you know, we're moving from an ombudsperson or ombudsperson's office, you know, to a commission that will be staying true also to the spirit, which is to bring those different perspectives that will allow, you know, that the listening, they allow the kind of a battle, you know, of ideas, but at the same time, you know, to not only challenge or to criticize or monitor like we often tend to do, but to incentivize action, incentivize, you know, right action into the right direction. And I think that should be a multi-dimensional composition that will be addressing a multi-dimensional issue. So that would be the main difference.
Thank you. So then there's a set of questions that relate basically to how does this proposal build on other initiatives? And there are two, for example, that have been highlighted. You know, one is that in the last 2 years, the result group 2 on inclusion and accountability, which has been focusing on developing solutions to address the issues that have been highlighted here, including the incentive on visibility. Another is the work that's been done in developing the core humanitarian standard, which sets out 9 commitments the sector has made to the people they're trying to serve and hold organizations to account. And this common humanitarian standard is a measurable, sort of verifiable standard. 110 organizations have been verified against it. So that's another idea. And I guess that this question really is, how does this build on, draw upon, take further those initiatives? And the second stream of things, a lot of our people watching right now keep coming back, is to sort of, how do you make sure that the commission is made up of or has enough people in there who have been part of the communities that the humanitarian system has been trying to serve? Just another way of making sure that those voices find their way. I mean, there's one proposal, in fact, from one of the viewers, Claudia Myers, saying you can actually make this composed exclusively of people who have been at the receiving end of the system, no exceptions, exclamation mark. So that's kind of, you know, if you like, one version of it, and then there's sort of less more doubtful versions of it, if you like, with a little bit more opportunities for other perspectives in the same thing. So that's the sort of second group of questions that. So could I ask you to just pick up on those two sets of issues, building on the other initiatives and making sure that the voices of the communities we're trying to serve are reflected in the commission?
Well, so firstly, I think, you know, some of the work that's been done in results group 2 of the IASC system, which is what was being referred to there, is you know, it's positive, good, useful work, but there's a couple of issues with it, really. Firstly, I mean, self-evidently, it's not independent. And secondly, the truth is it's had very limited traction. And we know that because we can go and ask people in crises what help they wanted and what they got, and we see a big gap between the two things. So my conclusion is the processes and systems we have at the moment to deal with this are not working. And this is, I mean, I think overwhelmingly, this is an issue about dignity and respect and caring about the opinion of people. I mean, that has said that in a very eloquent and powerful way. But it's also an issue about value for money. It's obviously not good value for money if you give people something that you want to give them and then they sell it to get something they actually want. I mean, and where value for money is not optimized, the consequence is you can't meet the needs of as many people as you would if you do optimize the value for money. And that's a really crucial issue when, as I said at the beginning, 40% of needs are unfunded. I think it's important for a variety of reasons to have voices of people who have in the past needed humanitarian assistance involved in the commission. I don't think that's the only relevant skill set, though. I think having a skill set which is used to these kind of big organizational issues and knows how to get things done in the kind of system we're talking about, that is also a valuable skill set. So there needs to be an appropriate balance, I think.
Thank you. I'll jump in anytime, please, if you have a point on this. But I want to come to one other point that has been raised. Actually, it shows up in every conversation that we do these days around any feature of international cooperation, which is, how do you see the role of the emerging donors and their receptivity, their approach to it? We have the same conversation when we talk about debt relief, we have the same conversation when you talk about new financing for development cooperation. And now here we are talking about humanitarian assistance and how we do that best. So you have a whole group of new donors that are becoming more and more important from the Middle East, from Asia. So how do you see their perspective on this issue? And is that going to make things easier or harder? And also in the commission itself, to what extent would the work of the commission sort of also help to influence and address their thinking directly?
I think there are a lot of issues about that we need to get into about why is it that there's rather a limited number of countries who contribute in a substantial way to shared endeavors to meet humanitarian need. And actually, on another occasion, I have some things I'd like to say about that. I have some proposals to make about that as well, because there are reasons, and I increasingly think it is decreasingly sustainable to rely on 4 donors for 70% of the $20 billion a year of humanitarian response coordinated by the UN. I don't think that is a sustainable position to be in. And as I say, I have some other suggestions to make about that, which are beyond the scope of what we're talking about today. In some cases, it's not that other players are not engaged, but they have other ways they want to play their part. But it is a problem, frankly, when you have a new crisis and you have dozens and dozens, sometimes scores, sometimes more than that, of different organizations all wanting to play often quite a small independent role in the response. That creates its own huge problems, as we see all too often. I would be very interested to hear responses from non-traditional sources to this kind of idea. People contribute to humanitarian action actually for a variety of different reasons, and understanding the reasons people contribute is one of the things you need to understand. One of the things we need to do. But there is something about our common humanity, about the fact that ultimately we all recognize, this is certainly my experience in talking to hundreds, probably thousands of people caught up in crises during the course, particularly of the last 4 years, the fundamental thing you learn, and by the way, when I stop doing this job, it won't be difficult for me to frankly forget a lot of the thousands of emails I've received, or a lot of the hundreds of planes I've been on, or a lot of the hundreds of meetings I've been in. It will be difficult for me to forget. I will always remember a lot of the conversations I've had with affected people in crises. What you learn when you talk to people is fundamentally they're exactly the same as everybody else, every other human being. They have the same hopes and aspirations, pain, fear, desires. The only difference is that life's lottery has, played out badly for them and well for the rest of us. And I think there is something fundamental that everybody who contributes to humanitarian action, from whatever part of the world they're in, which understands that and is responding to that. And plugging into that in a better way, more consistently, to get larger numbers of states to engage in sharing this endeavor is one of the things we need to do into the future.
Has any thoughts on that point?
Yeah, indeed, to my points, just to support what just Mark had said, the beneficiaries, victims, refugees, displaced, these are not identities of anybody. These are just situations. I think situations each of us could find ourselves in if we have the misfortune to be confronted with all issues we don't have any control over that can overnight, change everything, including changing your own identity. But there is always a country where it is happening. And when the shock comes, there is another country that may be hosting. And all those countries have a responsibility. We should not let off the hook. Those countries that have also to deliver for their own citizens. And we cannot shift the burden on the communities. We cannot shift the burden on the donors. And among the donors, a couple of them. And I think what we are calling here for, and I think that's the conversation I was having with Mark, is to have a larger community of carers. And those carers should be all the countries, the poorest countries, delivering on what they promise, to their people. Of course, it will not be enough. Of course, there will be gaps. And then one sees how those gaps, will be filled. Some of the poorest countries that are hosting the largest number of refugees on earth or displaced people. So, of course, we all, are arms up when, hundreds of thousands or even, let us say, 1 million goes to Europe or want to go to the US. Well, there may be 1 million in Kenya, there may be 1 million in Uganda, so there may be 1 million in Jordan, a small country, and those also needs to be recognized, validated, and supported, accompanied, and their contribution, as well be, if not recognized, there will be no incentives for that. Again, it is a community of carers across the board that will bring those different, dimensions, and also people affected and community affected, like one of the viewers, are saying. Again, I'm against any exclusivity or any only, as I said, because when you say exclusively composed of, well, then everything that starts with only or exclusive, I have a problem with, because then we will miss, some of these very important diversity, the very important different perspectives that we all need to be inclusive and then build that through community of carers.
I'm muted. You talked a bit earlier on the building on existing work, and we talked about the ISC as you mentioned. I want to come back to the core humanitarian standard, though, which sort of is these commitments that organizations, individuals can make to improve the quality and effectiveness of their response, and the question that comes back from a number of people listening to this is, how would this commission build on that, and how would it, or is it a sort of alternative to? Similarly, people saying, explore the linkages with the work of organizations like HQAI that use the Common Humanitarian Standard to conduct independent assessments of organizations' performance. So the broader question, I guess, is how does this commission fit into the ecosystem of efforts to improve effectiveness, which have been underway for a while? And if I could also put on the table, maybe this is sort of like a broader reflection, flip the question around and say, you've been now doing this for nearly 4 years, you kind of had a chance. Before that, you were on the inside of a government, in a very key role. And you've seen how decisions are actually made. I mean, and in a way, the question really becomes, what will change the behavior and mindset of those key donors whose actions will drive the structure and functioning of the humanitarian response system, because they're in many ways the drivers of it. So clearly from what you're saying, here we are 4 years later, you, others who've been trying before you to do the same thing, you keep running a little bit into I wouldn't say a brick wall, but there's a sort of limit as to how far one can bring the change about. And this would be one additional way to accelerate the pace of change by making public, in a more independent, transparent, high-profile way, the sort of failure of the system to deliver what is needed. And I guess my question to you, which is the broader question, is, based on your overall experience in the last 4 years and on the time before, what kinds of complementary actions would be needed to ensure that this initiative has its maximum impact, in terms of changing behavior? Because that's really what we're trying to get at. So building on the systems and how can one get the behavioral change? Thanks.
Okay, well, on the question of professionalization and standards and so on, one of the big improvements in the humanitarian system, really, I think, I would say over the last 20 years or so, I mean, as probably we'll have a view on the period over which this has happened as well, has been professionalization and things like Sphere and greater reliance on well-run organizations which are, well governed and have experienced people, and there has been an improvement in the standards on the provision of humanitarian assistance. My first job in the mid-1980s was working on the response to famine in Ethiopia, and at that point, essentially what we thought was that humanitarian relief was about food and a bit of shelter and maybe some water. But now we understand needs in a much broader sense, about the need to protect people, the particular vulnerabilities of women and girls, the particular vulnerabilities of people with disabilities, the fact that crises last longer, and so you face the risk of children losing any chance of any education for the whole of their life, and the consequences of that. There's a much broader understanding of humanitarian needs now, and that has been that is a very important way in which the system is much better than it used to be, as well as being much better financed. And let's remember that the humanitarian system has played an enormous role in contributing to that startling human progress we saw, certainly really in the 50-year period from the 1960s to the 2010s, with a huge reduction in number of people in poverty and loss of life in crises, and reduction in infant mortality, maternal mortality, and so on. The humanitarian system played an important role in that by reducing the number of people dying in crises in a way that needs to be recognized, and professionalization contributed to that. Fundamentally, though, you know, there is still what every young person who studies economics 101 learns about, the principal agent problem. That you know, humanitarian agencies are acting as agents on behalf of somebody else. And the fundamental point about the principal agent problem is you need to try to find ways to give the principal, the person you're really trying to benefit, greater voice and power and say. And that is the underlying concept that I'm trying to push here. And for as long as you rely on the agent as the main voice you're listening to, you shouldn't expect every desire of the principal to be, you know, to be responded to. That's the, you know, that's the underlying issue that I'm trying to get at in this proposal. Now, you've asked a very complicated and, you know, important question about complementary actions, Masood, and I honestly would want to think about that a bit more. But one of the other things I hope to have a chance at some point to say a bit more about is the fact that that one of the things I started with at the beginning of my remarks today, that we're in a phase really over the last several years, during the course of really from the middle of the last decade, of perhaps a bit earlier, of exploding need, really exploding need, and a huge increase in the number of people who won't survive without humanitarian assistance. And that has causes. And the fundamental causes are firstly, the state of geopolitics. There's a lot more conflict, and that's partly because the leading countries in the world have got less capable in resolving and preventing conflict. And a lot of humanitarian need is driven as a consequence of that. The second big driver is climate change. You know, a lot more climate-related events, not just the short-term ones like the storms and floods, but the longer-term ones like droughts and changing rainfall patterns. Now, they're very concentrated in terms of their worst effects in countries and places which already have the biggest humanitarian vulnerability and largest numbers of people in need. So this is a compounding factor on other factors like very deep poverty, which hasn't been addressed, poor governance, the impact of conflict, and so on. So my fundamental point is what humanitarian agencies deal with is symptoms. But until you address the causes better, you shouldn't be surprised if the symptoms keep getting worse. So, so there's a lot of things that going beyond today's topic, which also need to be addressed. But the reason today's topic is important is because apart from the issues around dignity and respect, we've got a system that's not sufficiently efficient. The value for money is not what it could be because we don't pay enough attention to listening to what people in crisis say they want and then giving it to them.
Yes. As did you want to come in on that?
Yeah, just wanted to add that an initiative like this one is really definitely a beginning of a journey where one may not have, you know, all the answers to all questions. And there will also be, I think, references to initiatives, you know, in the past, you know, that were taken forward. There may be many reasons for inaction or not for doing it. And they may be, you know, valid ones. And there may be also a good reason now to see where we are today, which is quite unprecedented. You know, we keep on saying year after year, you know, that we have reached, you know, unprecedented levels, you know, of humanitarian suffering, the numbers of people displaced, you know, getting into the, I remember when we talk about, in my own career, I remember the figure of 40 million, which was, my goodness, you know, out of this world. You know, now we are 80 million again. So I think, how long, you know, would we just, you know, wait, you know, until, you know, we get into the crunch time? What is a saturation point? I think that will all, motivate us, to elevate, at that level. So I don't know what that saturation point is, but I definitely know that we're not far from it. And we don't need to wait, until we hit, ourselves more on the wall, to start thinking and engaging in a journey. And that we will have to walk along, together, answer the questions for which we have, answers, even discover new questions that we are not thinking about, right now, and then building on all the other accumulated knowledge and experience and partnerships, so far, as a baseline, to try to move forward. So that's the only thing I wanted to add, at this point, and that's why also I'm making this humble contribution to it today.
Thank you very much, Charles. That's really, it gives us a sense of, you don't have to hit the wall to realize you're getting close to it. And we are getting close to it. So maybe, Mark, 2 points that are more related to your own role, or 3 actually, sort of questions that have come up. I mean, one is the sort of timing of this initiative. So there's the skeptical version of it is sort of like, well, you're coming to the end of your term there now, so thanks a lot, but what we can do about it. But in a way, the more constructive version of that is, how do you ensure the momentum for this if you're going to be moving on? So, whoever comes on, doesn't actually necessarily share this as their number one priority. So how does one make sure that this idea survives the transition? And then the second question, which I think people have raised, is one that applies in your transition, but applies to many transitions in the international system, which is that I'm assuming that your successor is going to be appointed, selected, not through some open competitive process. And so the question is, why not? Should that be the case, etc. And then I guess in a way, the third thing, which I'd like to perhaps end with, is a bit your reflection on, 4 years into this role. And you've laid out how you've seen the problems get worse, why they've got worse. You've sort of laid out also, in a way, the kinds of factors that would be needed in a broad sense to address the underlying causes. But if you had, your envelope to your successor with 3 pieces of advice for your successor, and leaving aside the sort of traditional version of this envelope, which is the joke, but seriously, if you were to leave behind 3 pieces of advice for your successor, what would be the advice that you would offer to your successor at this point, reflecting on your own time in office and the world in which we live? So those 3 questions, please.
So, I mean, look, the first question is an excellent question. Why didn't I say this 3 years ago? I mean, I think that's a really good question. Actually, of course, one of the things that happens to you when you do this job is you learn as you go along. And I have been thinking about this for a while. The truth is, I got rather derailed a year ago by the pandemic. And so in an ideal world, I wish I'd raised this kind of issue and done more to progress it myself earlier in my tenure. But, the world isn't always ideal. It won't be up to me primarily to pursue the bits of this initiative that I have set out for OCHA, because I think it's better that I leave the idea with my successor and respect, however, that person, who will have lots of other things on their plate, decides to factor this idea in. I am hoping in the future to be able to continue to make a contribution in various ways. And, this is something I I've come to feel, as I've thought about it over recent months, quite strongly about. So I'll be knocking on doors on this point probably for a while, and I hope I can play a role in taking it forward in a constructive way. On the selection of my successor, actually there is a process. I mean, the job's been advertised, and anybody that has been invited who thinks they have the skill set to apply, and I happen to know there've been interviews, and I'm sure what the Secretary General is going to do is select the person he thinks is best able to do the job. I prefer the three envelopes answer to your question, Masood, actually, which is I think what you're referring to as the traditional response. But how these things work. I will be entirely available to whoever my successor is, depending on that person's experience and existing knowledge and things they feel they don't know. We'll talk about whatever they want to talk about, as much as they want to or as little as they want to. The sort of commitment I have made to the Secretary General is actually quite a number of months ago now, that I said to him that I thought, mostly for family reasons, I wanted to hand over to somebody else. But I did say I would stay in this post until he selected my successor. And then that person I will be entirely available to help in any way I can. But it'll be up to them, really, as it should be, to make the running on what they want to hear from me on and what they frankly rather not hear from me on. And then I hope that I'll have other opportunities to make a broader contribution. Like you and like Az, this has been the whole of my adult life doing this kind of work, and I can't help having a series of experiences and opinions about it, and hope that I'll maybe have another or maybe more than one platform in future to continue to contribute.
Thank you very much, Mark. I think that certainly we will all look forward to ways in which your voice can continue to help influence and shape the system. I mean, you have been a voice on the inside of the system, a very influential voice, as you say, for many decades now. And now, I think in some ways, the next phase also will be an opportunity to perhaps look at some of these things a little bit from the outside. And sometimes what I've discovered in my own life is that if you look at the same thing from the outside, you get a slightly different view than you do when you spend most of your time looking at the world from the inside through the same window. So the two sides of the window aren't always the same, but they're both equally valuable. And frankly, having been on both sides of it helps you to understand each side a little bit better. So we're all looking forward to that. So I want to thank you for taking the time today. As really grateful that you were able to spare the time as well to join us, and very much appreciated your comments as well. And I want to thank also all of the people who contributed, the participants who sent in questions, and no doubt we'll continue to send you questions and comments beyond today's event. Thanks for everyone.
Thank you very much.